Okay, good morning. I think it's a good time for us to get started. Welcome everybody to what is our last day of the conference on guiding seed sector transformation in Africa. You're all very welcome to this session. We'll get started in just a moment. I'll hand over to my colleague Gareth Borman. We are a small group in this, what is a parallel session away from the main plenary. They are sending people over to us right now, I believe, and we still expect a few people to participate. In any case, no problem that we're a small group. It hopefully will encourage some quite active contributions and engagement with you guys in the audience. We have a couple of presentations to get through, a couple of slides, and after that we'll open it up for a nice discussion. And also keep your eye out for some polls which we will run and which we hope you can contribute to as well. That said, again, welcome also to our panelists, but I will allow my colleague Gareth to take it over from here and introduce us and take us forward. Thanks, Gareth. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, James, and good morning, everyone. Indeed, it's good to see that the attendance is rapidly going up. I'm glad people are coming to join us because we have a very interesting topic and panel for our discussion today on an investor guide for Africa, generating seed market intelligence. Just in terms of expectations, we will have one presentation and followed by the panel discussion, and I'll be introducing the panel. Let's do that now. With us today is Mr. Elijah Washinyeni from East West Seed Knowledge Transfer. Elijah is Africa Head for the Knowledge Transfer, which is a not-for-profit foundation of the international breeding company East West Seed. And what Knowledge Transfer Foundation does is it showcases profitable and sustainable farm practices in many areas that would otherwise be of limited interest to seed companies. Welcome, Elijah.
Thank you.
Also with us, hi there, Elijah. Welcome. Also with us today is Mr. Sami Khan. Sami leads the Food and Agriculture Strategy at CDC Group. For those of you who are unfamiliar with CDC, it is the UK government's Development Finance Institute with a core geographical focus in Africa and the Indian sub-region, where they have successfully implemented over 70 years of development work. Welcome, Sami. And our third finalist, our third and final panelist for today is Dr. Ed Mabaya. Ed is founder and current scientific advisor for the African Seed Access Index, which is an initiative monitoring seed sector performance in Africa. He is also a research professor in the Department of Global Development at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, where Ed is also joining us from today, either having refrained from going to bed or an early riser indeed. Good morning to you, Ed.
Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Ed. All right, I'll get us started then. James, if you can progress onto the next slide, please. James, can you hear me? Thanks. Okay, so just to give a bit of context to the session today, this shares some of the work conducted under the sponsorship of the GSST Africa program. I work for Wageningen University in Research and lead the coalition of partners behind the topic of creating demand for quality seed. James, next slide, please. What we observe in Africa is limited use of quality seed, low rates of turnover of new and improved varieties, and yields that lag behind other regions of the world. And all of this despite the billions of dollars invested to date in crop improvement. The objective of the topic and the coalition behind it is not only to increase demand to meet supply, but also to better match what is supplied with what farmers really want. Next slide, please. To this end, we conduct action learning activities to find answers to the questions: what knowledge do stakeholders need to better understand seed markets and demand? What actually works in promoting quality seed use? And how can we influence the policies, strategies, and practices of different stakeholders that are applied to create demand for quality seed? One example is the research that's been conducted by Wageningen University and Research, which I will present here today, on generating intelligence on Africa's emerging seed markets. This and other activities of GSST Africa are funded by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation and the Netherlands government, amongst several others. And many organizations collaborate under this topic, as you can see by the logos on the screen. And if you would like to know anything more about GSST Africa and the topic in particular, please visit our website for more information. Okay, that's a bit of the context. Let's dive into the topic. James, if you could, yeah, thank you. So I'll be presenting on behalf of my colleagues Flo Dirks and Anna Gupta. Flo Dirks has been leading the research. She cannot join us today. She's on maternity leave, and we wish her all the best. James, you can go to the next slide. So a brief outline. I've given a bit of a background to what we're here about today, and I'll also explain the method of the research that we've been conducting, some of the preliminary findings and points for consideration. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned already, this is work that is sponsored by GSST Africa, but what I haven't said yet is that it's been conducted in response to several stakeholders' requests for a dashboard of indicators that can be used to assess the attractiveness of investing in different African seed markets. This dashboard should also be of equal importance or value to commercial and impact investors and the private and public sectors alike. Accordingly, it should cover a wide range of food security crops and commodities. Next slide, please. So, just in terms of how the research has been conducted, well, we started off with interviews of several key informants from across different knowledge institutes and different types of investors. I'm happy to see several of you here today. Thanks very much for your input thus far, and also for your participation in this, let's call it a validation meeting. Second, we dived into different sources of information, including the African Union Commission and its African Union Development Agency biennial reviews of progress in the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, CAADP. We've also looked at COMISA, ACTISA, and in particular their concept notes for a seed information system, or COMSIS, the African Seed Access Index, TASAI, Access to Seeds Index, Agrobiodiversity Index, the Food Systems Dashboard, the World Bank, its open data, and also enabling the Business of Agriculture Index, FAOStat, and various initiatives tracking progress against the indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. Many different indicators, or many different indices and sources of information to be taken into account, and what we see is that these indicators converge around 4 different categories. Those that assess seed sector performance, those that assess the potential, let's say, absorption of crop harvests in output markets, the size of those output markets, current progress against indicators of impact, and different variables giving more specific context to each country. Next slide, please. Under each of these categories, we've done some further aggregation. So for the seed sector, these include indicators of seed demand, seed supply, seed regulatory function. For output markets, they include the size or value of these markets, the level of investments made in farm productivity, such as input use and good agronomic practices, and the level of organization of producers in leveraging economies of scale. Next, regarding impact, we consider different indicators of poverty reduction, food security and nutrition, and climate change adaptation and mitigation, and biodiversity conservation, management, and use. On the last category, country context, to give some context to each country, we look at demographics, political and economic stability, and infrastructure. For all of these, let's say, a mosaic of data is already available from the indices I've mentioned and other sources of information. And important to our efforts thus far has been to collate these data that are available in the public domain. Next slide, please. Now, what we feel is an important concept in giving weight to each of these indicators by different users, by different investors, is market archetypes. An archetype refers to the origin of a pattern and is used in this context to predict different market behaviors. On the y-axis, from bottom to top, you can see the increasing demand for the crop grown from quality seed of improved varieties. And on the x-axis, from right to left, you have increasing marginal value of seed of those varieties. So clockwise from the upper left, you have high demand and high value for quality seed to low demand and low value for quality seed in the bottom right. So what you can interpret from this, quite straightforward, is that each quadrant offers different potential for profit making. Therefore, the interests of commercial and impact investors are distributed unevenly. And we also believe that these archetypes are fairly accurate in predicting the seed business models of different crop types, such as vegetables, sweet potato, sorghum, and cotton, for example. Whilst vegetable and cotton seed may be firmly in the hands of the private sector, ensuring that there's sufficient quality seed of improved varieties for sweet potato and sorghum growers requires public investment. Next slide, please, James. We've also learned that the TSI, access to seeds, and enabling the business of agriculture indices overlap in 17 countries in Africa where data from CADA biannual reviews are also available. These countries across Western and Central and Eastern and Southern Africa offer the most readily available information for making investment decisions. All right, James, you can go to the next and I believe final slide before we get into the panel discussion. Some points to consider are, in our view, whether there is a value proposition in simply collating available data, as I've shown the method to here, or if this should include giving weight to different indicators and more, let's say, qualitative recommendations to investors. What else is needed by investors beyond market intelligence, and what is therefore the minimum viable product for such a service? And lastly, among our audience here today, are there any interested parties, people you think might be interested to join forces in prototyping such a service in the near future? Okay, I think, James, if you advance the next slide, that should be, yes, indeed. So that's where I'd like to kick off the panel discussion now. So what I'll be doing is I've got a few pre-prepared questions that I'd like to pose to the panelists. Please also post your questions in the chat pane. I'll be monitoring that as well. We have a nice-sized audience today, and perhaps we can also give you the opportunity to take the floor. All right. So first thing I'd like to ask is Sammy. Sammy, if you could, if necessary, provide a little bit more of an introduction to CDC Group so that our attendees are familiar with the type of organization you are, and explain what kind of returns on investment are you looking to make, and can you apply that to Africa's emerging seed markets?
Good morning, or thank you. Good morning to Elijah and Ed and everybody else. So CDC is, we call ourselves, and we take pride in that, we are the oldest development financial institution in the world, also the oldest impact investor. We started activities about 48, 49, and since then, we have been a permanent investor, so to speak, in Africa. Since our beginning, we have cumulatively made about 415 investments amounting to almost 6 billion pounds in today's money, and 70 to 80% of those investments were in Africa. Naturally, given that we are an impact investor and not purely a commercial investor, we take a slightly different view when we look at investments. We sort of take a long-term view and apply a patient capital approach. Outside of the traditional growth capital that you see in private equity, we also have a capital tool called Catalyst. Catalyst capital essentially allows us to participate in riskier markets with a view to transform that particular subsector and company over the long term. And everybody knows from experience that agriculture already is inherently swamped with a higher level of risk versus other sectors. And in some cases, the gestation period of some of the crops, especially some of the high value crops like avocados and cocoa and palm oil, the commercial gestation period could be upwards of 4 or 5 years. So therefore, there is a need to apply a patient capital approach. And this is where we actually walk the talk. And it goes without saying that as a development financial institution, we have a dual mandate, both in deriving basic commercial returns that allow us to become self-sustaining, but also, more importantly, for us to achieve the targeted development impact over a period of time in terms of creating jobs, livelihood, sustainability, and climate change. Even up to now, our core focus has, we have a very limited geographic mandate, unlike some of the other DFIs from the other European countries, as well as like DFC or IFC from US. We only focus on Africa and South Asia. And obviously we take a priority focus on some of the fragile states in those continents. So having said that, seeds can play a critical part in helping us achieve our development impact and target higher yields and incomes for smallholder farmers. Also address some of the issues related to climate change, resource conservation, and develop, with the development of stress-resistant seeds. I think that this is a game changer, can be very transformative. In terms of what you asked, we don't have a specific range of internal rate of return we're looking at, but as a comparison to typical private equity, as you know, the typical private equity players can be vested into a company for 4 to 5 years, and they typically look for a target return of 20% as a minimum and can go upwards. We will typically be happy over the long term, and we can stay invested in companies of up to 10 to 12 years. We'll be happy with a return ranging from anywhere between 5 to 10%, and that depends on case to case. And to achieve those commercial objectives, we apply a flexible product approach, meaning that we provide debt, we provide equity. Unlike some of the other DFIs, we are unique in our capabilities to do long-term value creation, work with all participants across the supply chain, the value chain, to build up a commercial, robust commercial case, as well as achieve the target development impact returns. So essentially, the range varies, but in addition to private equity and debt, we have venture capital and intermediate equity funds. So we have about close to 700 million invested in the food and agriculture sector right now, out of which 85% is in Africa, and most of that is through our LPs, our GPs, in which we are an LP. But we're increasingly looking to make direct investments, and the C sector is definitely one of the focus areas that we want to look at going forward.
Thank you very much, Sami. I assume you can also, you've seen that we've been running a poll while you've been speaking. I'm going to share these results now. From your experience making investments in Africa, do you recognize some of these opinions? The question was, what are the major barriers to investment in Africa's emerging seed markets? And many people believe it's fragmented market intelligence, the topic for which we're here today.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely concur with this, with, of course, fragmented market intelligence, but some of the other points as well.
Great, thank you very much. I see that in second place, there's also unpredictable government or donor interventions and political and economic instability. Thanks very much to our audience for answering that question. And I also, Sammy, it's really interesting to hear that for a commercial lender, often returns of about 20% are expected over 4 to 5 years. I wasn't aware of that. So thanks also for providing such a comparison with CDC.
But that, sorry, just as a caveat, that ranges from continent to continent, as well as the strategy that's being deployed by that particular private equity company. But typically, when you talk to a private equity investor, they will look to seek an exit anywhere between year 3 to 5, and would like at least a minimum return of 20 to 25%.
Okay, great. Thank you,
Yeah.
Sammy. And thanks also for the caveat. I think in any case, let's compare on time horizons, much shorter to medium term investment than what you're prepared to make. On that, I'd like to then go to Elijah. Elijah, you find yourself in an interesting position working for the Knowledge Transfer Foundation, which is not for profit, but I think it put good insights into the commercial and sales business of East West Seed. What kinds of returns on investment are you looking to make, and what informs your investment decisions?
Thank you, Gareth, for this opportunity. I think we, in terms of East West Seed, we always look at opportunities, the potential in the countries that we want to go into. And we look at opportunities for long-term business rather than quick returns. And so that's the way we actually look at it. But before we actually talk about what we consider in terms of investment, or before we invest, let me share a little bit about our mission so that it becomes clearer. Our mission is to provide innovative products and services that will help to increase the income of vegetable farmers and promote the growth and quality of the tropical vegetable industry. We have a long history of going into countries and communities struggling with low yields and weak value chains, and building the capacity of smallholder farmers, and also strengthening those value chains. And now, with this in mind, the things that we consider in a country or in an area include what I call the usual suspects, some of which Gareth has already sort of presented earlier. Related to the seed sector, of course, things like seed demand and seed supply, and what kind of regulation is there. In terms of the markets, we also look at market size. We look at what farmer organizations are there. We also look at what our impact will be. One of the big things that we have really incorporated in our approach is to make sure the smallholder farmer makes a profit. So we look at a situation and say, are we able to make a difference in terms of impact? Are we going to affect the food and nutrition of the communities? And of course, in terms of the country context, we also look at the demographics, stability, and so forth. There are maybe one or two other additional considerations that we look at. We look at potential partnerships. What we have realized in this business is to make big impact, we need to work in partnership with other organizations. If you look at our knowledge transfer work, where we build the capacity of farmers, we use a percentage of our own funding, of our own sales from seed, vegetable seed, in order to use that to train farmers. But that's not enough. So we leverage the resources of like-minded organizations so that we actually have bigger impact. That means we need partnerships. Of course, from a knowledge transfer perspective, we also look at what extension services are there. You will find out that in the areas where we go into, where farmers are struggling with low yields, they're struggling to get information on growing vegetables as a business. A lot of the national extension services are struggling. So we go in also and provide our own extension services so that we are able to make impact.
Thank you very much, Elijah. And I also imagine that as a business of breeders, you're quite familiar with at least the expectations of returns on a longer term perspective. Just for curiosity's sake, how long does it take to develop a new variety for the tropics?
In terms of coming up with a new variety, if you are looking at hybrids take up to 12 years to develop. So in terms of breeding programs, it's really long term. Of course, we can always shorten that by having multiple crop cycles during the year, but it's a long-term process. It's not something that we do overnight. That's why in terms of either the breeding, in terms of either the sales, in terms of even the training that we do, we always look at our presence in any country in the long term.
Great. Thank you very much, Elijah. Okay, I'd like to now then go to Ed. Ed, tell us about Tasai. What does Tasai do, and what are some of the requests you get from investors? What information are they looking for? Just remember to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for that excellent presentation. It's a delight to be here. So just very quick overview of Tasai here. Tasai is a tool that seeks to promote the creation and maintenance of edible environments for competitive seed systems that are serving smallholder farmers in Africa. It is actually this enabling environment for the seed sector that we seek to track, measure, and compare across different African countries. So the studies that Tasai conducts cover about 22 different indicators that are classified into 5 different categories, including research and development, industry competitiveness, seed policy and regulations, institutional support for the seed sector, and service to smallholder farmers. To date, Tasai has conducted covered about 20 different African countries, most of them with multiple rounds of studies. You can get more information by going to the Tasai website. In terms of the interest from investors, we get indebted with requests from the private sector and investors who are looking to invest in the seed sector. I would like to highlight that a large part of that interest is mostly, maybe for investors, would be 2 categories, because Tasai is serving also policymakers, development partners, and the private sector. So I would say much of the interest from investors would fall into industry competitiveness and in the area of seed policy and regulations. And I'm glad this is also areas that have been highlighted by our audience. Under industry competitiveness, there's a strong interest in knowing what the quantity of seed that is produced and sold, supply and demand of seed. There's an interest in market concentration. There's an interest in the share of presence of the government in the seed sector in terms of the government parastatals and the efficiency of import and export processes. And then for policy and regulations, there's a strong interest in knowing the length of variety release processes, the status of regional harmonization, adequacy of efforts to eradicate fake seed, and the use of government subsidies. Generally, I would say that there is a very strong interest in investors looking for social impact in agriculture in Africa. Seed sector comes up first. In fact, I would challenge you and the audience here that it is harder to get a higher return, social and financial return, than a bag of seed placed in the hands of smallholder farmers. So there is indeed a lot of strong interest in the product that we're discussing here today. Will get a big audience. There's such an interest in both social and financial returns to seed sector. So this is a very fertile area for
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed. Ed, I'll be coming back to you with a follow-up question. I see Elijah. See what looks like you're typing. Can you just? There's 2 questions that have been posed to you by the audience. One from Chris Ojiwo and one from Walter de Boef. If you wouldn't mind trying to address those in the chat bar, that would be great. Thanks, Elijah. Ed.
Yes, I'm doing that.
Considering what information Tasai has available and all these other sources of information, is collation? Is there a value proposition in that? Is it enough? Is this a service that's readily available? Do you think that there's demand for such a service?
Karen, I think it's for an industry that is changing very, very rapidly. There's never enough information. If you're an investor that's working in a high risk environment, there's never enough information. So I think any additional information we can put to this field would bring value for everybody. I say there's never enough information because of two main things, right, really. One is that this sector is rapidly evolving. The seed sector today in Africa is different from just 10, 20 years ago. You find very few sectors that are transformed this rapidly. The second part, and I think this is very clear, this is very important to get our audience to appreciate. The seed sector in different African countries is actually at different stages of development. You have countries that are still very much in the nascent stage, and you have countries that are very much in the mature and advanced stage. So think of that spectrum from Somalia to South Africa. There is very different interest of different information that we want to get from those. And I think much of the investor information that is required is mostly that growth phase, that the countries that are somewhat in the middle. So it's going to be very hard to get a one-head-fit-all approach across that entire spectrum. And that because we're chasing a moving target, the policies are changing, the climate is changing, the environment is changing, you're always going to need to have a product that is also being modified consistently to meet the requirements of the investors and the industries, but also just appreciating the diversity that African continent presents. It's simple for us to sit here and discuss African seed market as if it was one thing, but even within the same country, you're going to find different pockets when it comes to type of crop, when it comes to cereals versus vegetables, one country versus another. So there's so much that we could do to get high resolution information that is useful for investors. So there's so much more that we can do in this space.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thanks also for highlighting the importance of that nuance. Indeed, we're talking about a massive region here. Sammy, reflecting on what Ed has had to say about the importance of more information, do you think collation of this information is enough, or what else would you be looking for as an investor?
Yeah, so having said the proposition that we are willing to invest over the long term, unlike some of the typical private equity investors or commercial lenders, and given that we are willing to take a lower return threshold versus your typical commercial enterprises, it means that our due diligence process has to be a lot more robust, because we'll be invested in that company for instance, Elijah mentioned in some of these seed breeding hybrid programs, it could take 10, 12 years. So certainly we're willing to take a long-term view, but we need to make sure that we have access to information. And unfortunately, in the case of the seed sector, the level of information, both on the commercial side, the landscape, who's doing what, is lacking. So definitely collation is lacking. We definitely need that, because as an investor, and my investment teams will speak in volumes about that, their DD is not robust until they have those targeted hard and soft data points. One of the things that we look at in our investments into the food and agriculture sector is that we have a strategic investment team, a team to take a integrated value chain approach, or fully integrated value chain approach, which means that we want all stakeholders to be part of it, and smallholders play a very critical role, because this is where we get the maximum development impact. But at the same time, we need to ensure there's a commercial off-taker, a commercial party on the other hand, whether it'll be a multinational or be a company that operates out of an agri-industrial park that needs to have a robust agri-hinterland to supply the product at the right quality, right volume, right grading, and for that you need the right seeds. We need that kind of a system. I think the market intelligence to be frank, in most of the subsectors that we come across in food and agri is lacking, but more so in the case of seeds. So there's definitely a recurring challenge from investor perspective that we have on market intelligence, having access to credible figures, both the micros and the macros of the industry, the performance of seeds by key markets and crops, what's the latest on policy and regulation, if there are any IP related issues. So yeah, I would agree that no doubt there's a lot more that's required in terms of getting the right sort of intelligence, collating this information, but more importantly, also coming up with some sort of analysis that can really help to connect the investors to the supply chain in Africa.
Indeed, thank you, Sammy. It's on that point of just the interpretations that are made from it that I would like to just move the questioning on now to Elijah. But I would like you to just think about something in the meantime, Sammy. The question that was posed by Walter de Boef to the panel about there's a 12-year breeding span, but then there's also the market creation thereafter and establishing yourself in the region or a given country. So we're talking about a pretty long-term investment. Are seed companies also the kinds of beneficiaries of CDC that you would be interested in working with and forming partnerships with? You can just think about an answer to that, and I'll go to Elijah and then come back to you. Elijah, who do you just remember to unmute yourself? Who do you turn to for advice when you're starting up in, say, Nigeria, for example?
We do tend to a number of stakeholders. When I was talking earlier about us working with partners whenever we go into a country, in many cases it is actually some of those potential partners that share information with us, so that we are able to understand what is going on in the country. That's number one. Number two, if you're taking the specific example of Nigeria, we also get a lot of advice from Minister of Agriculture. If you look at the work that we are doing in Kaduna and Kano at the moment, we are actually doing that in association with the Minister of Agriculture. They have a lot of information on what is happening in their country, and so it's easier for us to work with them and get advice from them. And we also work very closely with knowledge partners. Wageningen is one of our knowledge partners that has a lot of experience in many of these countries. And so, they help us a lot in terms of interpretation of the data. They help us a lot in terms of the other knowledge that we need to get from the countries. The example of Nigeria, we are working very closely with the Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria. And that is very important for getting local advice in terms of this sector. We've had other experiences even in other countries working very closely with other institutions. So the multi sort of partnership approach that we work with tends to give us a lot of information before we actually get into a country, and even when we are in there.
Thanks very much, Elijah. So thanks for mentioning universities as being an important source of information, and government as well. Ed, I saw you nodding in agreement when Elijah said government. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, definitely. I mean, governments have, we're going to get into this a little bit later on. They have quite a reservoir of information in Africa. So we rely on them in terms of the information that they provide, but also just the actions that governments take more than the information. In most of these countries, government subsidy programs are still accounting for the bulk of the demand. So knowing what the government intends to do is a very critical point of market intelligence. So knowing what is planned for the next season, knowing how the government is responding to COVID-19 in terms of seed sector is a very, very critical point of information. So in almost every country that we do our work, we find that the government itself to be both a primary source of that information, but also a consumer of this information, because they're also wanting to know what the industry, and they want somebody to put all this information together. So they're an equal partner in this intelligence government.
Thanks very much, Ed. Okay, Sammy, back to you. Had some time to think about it. Do you have an answer to the question?
I don't know if I have a answer that satisfies the person who asked this question, but as a sort of a DFI, one of the things that we don't engage in is providing grants, or we don't fund sort of R&D sort of setups. Uh, we would be keen to fund sort of R&D setup which has a gestation period. Could be a seed development program, but there has to be some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the commercial mechanics. So for instance, if it was a pure breeding program that is just for 10, 12 years with no commercial returns that come out of it, it'll be very difficult for us, because that we can't do, because we need to have a commercial return. But for us, development impact is also achieved when this commercial viability established early on, and the smallholder farmers can start achieving the benefits of the increase in productivity, and so on and so forth, and there's a market offtake agreement. So I think, for instance, in the case of maybe this is not a comparable situation, but like I mentioned earlier, we can say invested in commercial crops like palm oil, or even in forestry for up to 10, 12 years, because the commercial cycle only begins in year 6 or 7, say, for palm oil. But in the cases of seeds, we need to have some commercial return, so that when we do exit. Sorry.
Let me pose it this way then, Sammy. Say there's a company that already has a promising portfolio of products for the region, for the type of agroecology, and they're looking to establish in a completely new country, new networks. Ethiopia, for example, where there's a limited portfolio of fruit and vegetable varieties available. And the company wants to go there. Is there partnership with CDC?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we'll be very keen on it. As long as a company that's looking to enter the market has got some track record of commercial success. And secondly, there's enough, going back to the point that we were talking about earlier, enough market intelligence for investment teams to do due diligence on to make a decision. But yes, absolutely. So for instance, we'll certainly like to partner with the big boys, both in the regional African champions or international players, and help them come into new markets and try out new crops. But obviously we need market intelligence. So we need market intelligence on how this particular seed for a particular crop has performed in similar conditions, maybe not necessarily in Africa, but in other parts of the world. We need to have that data points to be able to make a robust commercial and technical assessment of the business plan. But in a short answer, yes, we are absolutely keen. So this would be sort of a greenfield operation, but what will be important for this greenfield operation is having a reputable partner with a solid commercial track record on board.
Thank you, Sammy. And then is it appropriate if companies solicit your services? Can they reach out to you? Can we also share some contact details for CDC with them?
Yeah, absolutely. However, I would like to say that we have a minimum ticket size. I know it may not be it may not meet the market needs of a number of participants, but we have a minimum ticket size in equity of $20 million US. In debt is $10 million. The whole idea is that we want to create a transformation at scale. We have tried a strategy where we participate in sub $10 million, sub $5 million deals, but we were not able to achieve the desired development impact. So we want to do things big. And people can certainly are welcome to contact us, but they need to keep in mind that we have a minimum ticket size of 20 million, and for debt is anywhere between 10 to 15 million.
Okay. Thank you, Sammy. If you wouldn't mind sharing the appropriate contact details in the chat, that would be great. To our attendees, please, when you do ask a question, if you would like for the other attendees to also reflect upon it, please address it to all panelists and attendees. Many questions are coming just to the panelists, and we won't be able to address them all, but your fellow attendees might have the answer you're looking for. there's also the Padlets, of course, which we've referred to at several moments throughout the conference, where you can also post your questions. What I would like to ask now, Elijah, what about predictions and future scenarios? Do you factor these into your investment decision making? And what makes a prediction trustworthy? Just unmute yourself.
Predictions come into play. Predictions in terms of what the trends will be like. It could be consumer trends, it could be market trends, it could be even political trends. They do come into play. But what normally makes trends trustworthy is how related are they to previous trends? As we have had a lot of experience in many countries in Asia and in some countries in Africa, we are now quite familiar with sometimes how things will go. So when we get predictions, we relate it to what we've already experienced before. And then we are able to say, okay, things went that way and we are able to go this way.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elijah. And I see Ed's also itching to say something. Ed, I'll come to you in a second. Before I do that, I'm just mindful of time. Elijah, you mentioned partnerships. So potential partners being a very important part of the intel you're looking for. I'd like to run the next poll, please, which is what are some of the barriers or obstacles that stand in the way of effective investment partnerships? Are these mismatches between national and international investors' capacities, public and private investors' ambitions of scale, investors' prioritization to reach the poor and or last mile, time horizons for expected returns on investment, or different obstacles entirely? While the audience answers that question, Ed, please go ahead. You're muted, Ed.
Okay, sorry. I was just going to weigh in a little bit on the prediction question. This is quite, let me just focus on the supply and demand of seed, for example. So you find that this prediction is valuable, but it's also the question of how much can you trust this prediction? There's almost two different responses to that, depending on if you look at the seed supply versus demand. So let's start with the easy side. Seed supply is fairly easy to predict for two reasons. One is that the industry for certified seed is fairly regulated. So almost all seed goes through some regulatory agency where you can find those certification process things going down the line. So you can get that data often quite easily. But secondly, there's kind of a lagged or derived demand in seed supply. So you start off with the demand for early generation seed, for example. Then the seed companies produce the crop, then they supply in the subsequent years. So if you look very carefully at the pipeline, you can see almost 2 years down the line how much seed is going to be available on the market. So that makes it fairly easy. But the harder part is actually on the demand side. Demand, if anybody has been in most of African countries, you realize that smallholder farmers will buy seed after the first rains. It's almost like they black out. They don't know if they're going to buy seed, and about 70 to 80% of the purchases take place within a 2-week period. So it's fairly difficult to predict the demand. And you add on to that, there's a fairly unpredictable subsidy program, both by government and NGOs. And they're still a very big part of the seed demand equation. So if those things are still very unpredictable, government subsidy programs and NGO interventions, you're going to remain in this industry where things can go, magnitudes of 50 to 100% changes in demand within this 1 year. So fairly difficult to predict.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thanks all of you. I can almost feel James breathing down my neck. We are approaching the end of our time. The poll has closed. I'm going to share the results. Last words, Sammy, if you wouldn't mind just taking a look at this. One of the leading opinions is that there's a mismatch between public and private investors' ambitions of scale in terms of the area that they want to reach or the number of ultimate beneficiaries that they want to reach. Can you give a quick reflection on this from your own experience?
Yeah, I understand where that's coming from. Even based on what I've just mentioned, I think there's definitely a sort of and this is what I hear from potential companies, that Our size of investments is too large for them to handle. So there's definitely something that we are working on, but at this stage, it is the approach we're taking. However, we do have sister companies which are owned by the same shareholder, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office of the UK government, called EGDEFCO. EGDEFCO is a Pan-African organization. They do a much lower sized deals, anywhere from 0 to 5 million. I mean, sorry, from 2 to 5 million, 2 to 6 million. And the kind of scale that they're trying to achieve is slightly at a different level. But in the case of seeds, we believe that there could be, I mean, this is slightly different to answering your question, but I think could be an opportunity for, I don't know who would be the right party for us to organize a few more forums or investor summits focusing on the seed domain in Africa, where you bring all parties together. So there could be a forum. I see a lot of summits happening. I know there's one happening in Abuja, which I'm planning to attend in Nigeria. Feed the Nation Summit, organized by the Department of International Trade, bringing a lot of focus from international and regional investors into into Nigerian agriculture. I would love to see some sort of a preeminent seed platform or seed forum being developed, which will allow investors like us and other parties to go together. And sometimes when the scale is large, we share the risk. So you would see a lot of, if the deeds of critical mass, you'll see a number of DFIs, not just CDC alone. You'll see IFC, CDC, FMO, or even some of the other players come together and share the risk. But we want to do it at scale because we believe that's where the maximum development impact will take place.
Thank you very much, Sammy, and thank you for those recommendations. I'm going to hand over to James. Just a last word of thanks from me to all of our panelists and to the audience today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gareth. And yeah, to echo that, thanks to all of our panelists. Really enjoyable discussion. Also, thanks to you in the audience for your contributions and questions in the chat. As Gareth indicated, many of the questions actually and comments came in only sent to the panelists. So what we will try and do, or what we will do, is to make sure any of those questions, comments, everything is pasted onto the webpage for this session on GSST Africa, so people can see what was being said. Perhaps there's some interesting insights or linkages to be made there. Okay, that brings an end to this session. I would now like to hurriedly invite you all to head over to the main plenary. I'm putting the link in the chat for our next session, which is Seed Sector Transformation in Practice, GSST Uganda. That means I will actually physically close this webinar space. I will encourage you to click the link I've just put into the chat and you will directly enter there. I do hope to see you there. It'll be a very interesting session. Lots of achievements and lessons learned to take from 10 years, or a decade, I should say, of GSST in Uganda. Thanks for being here. See you over there momentarily. Bye-bye for now.